I am delighted to be joined by Professor Mark Griffith, Clio Distinguished Professor Emeritus of Classical Languages and Literature and Professor Emeritus of Theatre, Dance and Performance Studies at the University of California, Berkeley. His many publications include his seminal book, The Authenticity of Prometheus Bound from 1977, editions of and commentaries on both Aeschylus's Prometheus Bound, 1983, and Sophocles' Antigone, 1999, and an invaluable book on Aristophanes' Frogs from 2013. His forthcoming book, Music and Difference in Ancient Greece, will be available open access from the University of California Press soon. But beyond all of that, there is a personal reason why I'm delighted to welcome Mark on this podcast, and that is because he is why I'm where I am today. I came to the US to work with him for my PhD at Berkeley. So, Mark, thank you very much for being here and welcome to Ancient Greece today. As you know, we are talking today about the tragedy Prometheus Bound, on which you are very much an expert. I've already given a brief outline of the play, but I'm turning to you to think about what this tragedy is, what it is about. So maybe, first of all, I could ask you, what do we have here, or what do we not have? Can we reconstruct where this tragedy came in its tetralogy, or the larger story it's part of?
Yes, we have 7 plays that survive to the modern era in manuscripts that we can read entire, and Prometheus Bound is one of those 7 attributed to Aeschylus. We also know that he composed several of his plays were combined into trilogies of 3 tragedies followed by a satyr play, so a tetralogy altogether. And we happen to have, in the case of the Oresteia, we have the complete trilogy. In the case of several others of his surviving plays, we know what the other plays in the trilogy were, and we have little bits of them in some cases that help us show how the whole, a trilogy is something like a 3-act play, a big 3-act play. That's the way probably to think about it. So the 3 parts are normally really closely connected. In the case of the Prometheus, we happen to have a list in one of the medieval manuscripts. There's a list of the complete number of Aeschylus's plays, and it lists about 80 plays, including Prometheus Bound, Prometheus Being Unbound, Prometheus the Womanos, Prometheus Fire Carrier or Fire Bringer. Those 3 are all mentioned. We also have in marginal notes that we have in the manuscripts of the Prometheus Bound, we have remarks a couple of places. In the next play, blah, blah, blah. In the next play, he is released. In the next play, it's produced. So, and then we have several other references in other works of Greek literature to Aeschylus, and his Prometheus Unbound says blah, 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 or whatever. So we have pretty strong, not absolutely incontrovertible, but pretty strong evidence that there were 3 plays connected, and that particularly the Prometheus Being Unbound, the Leuwomenos, of which we have a number of quotations which fit pretty neatly into some of the predictions that are made in Prometheus Bound about Heracles showing up and shooting the eagle, and Prometheus talking to him, about a chorus of Titans that come, that's his brothers, who come and visit him and talk to him in rather the same way that the Oceanids do in Prometheus Bound. So there are a lot of resonances. There are quite a number of so-called fragments of the Prometheus Unbound. There's very little that's directly connected in the quotations to Prometheus the Fire Carrier. So whereas it seems pretty certain Prometheus Being Released was a sequel and followed on Prometheus Bound, and we can piece together fairly well how it works. And incidentally, there's another really key little detail here, that the introduction that survives in the manuscripts for the Prometheus Bound remarks the characters in this play are, and it lists them, then it includes Heracles and Gaia, Mother Earth. That's his mother. And it seems very, very likely that those have crept in because they're in the next play. But Heracles does indeed show up there. And if Gaia shows up, a bit like Ocean maybe showing up in Prometheus Bound, that would fit really. So we have lots of evidence for those two plays. We have frustratingly little evidence about the fire carrier. Because the fire carrier could either be, that would seem the most obvious, it's about Prometheus saving human beings from Zeus's extermination plan and bringing them fire. That's what Prometheus is really, really famous for, isn't it? But there are one or two other references in antiquity to a festival of Prometheus where he and Athena and Hephaestus all celebrate fire together and so on, and that possibly there was a third play in which he's carrying the fire. So that's the bundle of evidence, which can be taken different ways. Some people have even separated out and said, well, okay, Aeschylus wrote the Prometheus Unbound and somebody else wrote the Prometheus Bound. It seems to me that's pretty far-fetched, but it's not impossible.
And you yourself, what do you like to think happens after this play?
Oh, heavens. It's really tantalizing, isn't it? Because we can't get away from the fact that in the play that we have, in Prometheus Bound, there are different predictions made that contradict each other as to whether he will or won't ever be released, whether Zeus will or won't fall from power. And that prediction, as you know, has been picked up by Joseph Shelley and Karl Marx and other people as a possible way to take the trilogy. So, but also there are predictions, is he going to be bound and tortured for 30,000 years, which is what one of the marginal notes says, or 10,000 years, or just 13 generations? So there's some uncertainties as to how that's going to work, and whether particularly, it's made clear, isn't it, in the play we have, that somebody in the 13th generation that we recognize as being Heracles is going to come and release him from his pains. The question of whether Zeus has agreed to that and by now is ready to give or make friends with or whatever, reconcile with Prometheus, or whether Heracles comes and does that unilaterally, and then later on somehow Zeus and Prometheus have to be reconciled in a separate deal around perhaps the prediction about the danger of marrying Thetis and having a son mightier than his father. All of those questions. So you asked me, what do I think happened? I think probably, even though it still had its own problems, that somehow after that long period and under the duress of a threat of himself being overthrown, Zeus, to some degree, learns to be a bit more diplomatic or pragmatic. And when his son has intervened and shot the eagle, his son Heracles, who is very fond, he starts revising his attitude to Prometheus a bit. And in the negotiations around the imminent prospect of his marrying or raping, whatever one calls Zeus's engagements with women, with females, that he decides to release Prometheus and become somewhat more friendly towards him, and perhaps add to, there's another dimension which I would like to include, which I think is probably likely to have been part of the plan. And this comes from Plato's Protagoras, where the character Protagoras tells the story of Prometheus and the creation of humans And in that, Prometheus gives humans fire and technology, but it's Zeus and Hermes who give them justice and the principle of consideration for others. So social living and political living is something that, in that version of the story, we owe to Zeus and Hermes, whereas the technology for survival against the elements and dangers and all of that is something we owe to Prometheus. So there's a kind of alliance there, which doesn't necessarily depend on a close, warm friendship between Zeus, principle of power and dominance, and Prometheus, the principle of intelligence and forethinking, but it involves some kind of a cooperation between the two. So that's what I'd be inclined to think. I'm tempted by some of the interpretations that have more of a humiliation of Zeus, but that's just my enjoyment of dramatic pizzazz. I can't say that there's enough evidence in the play to know quite how Zeus is brought to reconciliation and support of Prometheus' project.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. And we'll come back to questions about Zeus's character in a bit. Maybe we could move on to how surprising, at least for modern readers and modern audiences, this play is. After all, it's a play that begins on the very edges of the known world where there are no humans. The first character who speaks is Kratos, power, accompanied by Bia, violence or force, and Kratos, power.
Female policeman, which is not common in antiquity.
Yes, true. I didn't even think of that. Yes. And then Kratos giving instructions to Hephaestus to hammer Prometheus, a Titan, into a rock. I mean, that is how the play begins, which seems, again, to a modern audience, but I would like to think also to an ancient one, rather dramatic and surprising. And of course, we can think of lots of other kinds of surprises in the play, not just the characters, although Io certainly is quite extraordinary as a half human, half cow hybrid, but also the sorts of stagings that it must have involved. For example, the final cataclysmic scene, and then the plot of the play too. I mean, on this podcast, we've just been talking about the Oresteia in the previous episode. We'll be moving on to Oedipus the King and Medea. We're in a very different plane here in all kinds of ways. So I was wondering, what are the most surprising and unusual aspects of this play for you, and how might we think about them?
Well, I agree. It is a phenomenal, extraordinary, dramatic venture. I mean, the whole cosmic scale and the chronological scale, particularly if it's a trilogy covering hundreds, thousands of years, the edge of the planet, all the elements, Prometheus' first speech addresses the air, the sun, the waters of the sea, the earth, and so on. So it's sort of elemental. And then it's about the really early days of humankind, battles amongst the gods for who runs the whole universe. And Zeus as a new ruler, kind of consolidating his power and bullying his perceived enemies left, right, and center. Zeus, the rapist, chasing after women and violating or threatening to violate them. And so and then the torture of Prometheus, which is absolutely grisly. I mean, it seems from the text we have that the sort of climax of the torture, you chain him up in this place where it's going to go through sleep deprivation, hot, cold, sort of from the seasons and the temperatures. and then you drive a metal stake right through his chest. It's a technique of torture and execution, technically referred to as impaling, and different monarchies in the Near East practiced it. The Greeks seem not to have regularly practiced it. But in any case, this is the king of the gods. This is what he does to people that he feels angered by. Why? Because they helped somebody that he wanted to wipe out. I mean, it sounds eerily familiar with some of the rulers on the planet today. But as a representation of the king god, Pater, it's startling. It's very hard to stomach. I mean, literally. And then the different reactions, and then completely out of the blue, I mean, we have literally out of the blue, we have a chorus of Oceanids flying in to meet him, which presumably there's a moment where you wonder, oh my goodness, is this the eagle already? There's something he hears flying around coming towards him. No, it's not. That's going to come later. Wait, the eagle will be even more torture. It's like, eternal punishments from God after you die. Okay, let's burn everybody forever. But so gods can be pretty cruel, but you don't normally stage that for a character whom you're being brought to sympathize with, because he is a lover of humans. He's a friend of humans. They use the Greek word philanthropos, which we can recognize. He has saved human beings. He's given us these gifts, and Zeus can't stand that. It's pretty staggering concept. How you get out of that, how you manage to get the two divinities to sort of make friends again, and what the human race is going to enjoy after the trilogy is over, there's a lot that's got to happen. So in some ways, I think, you could almost say it's a fortunate twist of manuscript traditions, which plays happen to have made it through the Middle Ages and which plays just didn't get copied and rotted away, and we don't have them. We just have the little fragments. In some ways, I hate to say it, but you could say it's almost a blessing. So we have this one play, which then leaves us having to figure, now what? At the end, when he sinks down into the earth as this sort of earthquake tsunami thing goes on all around him, the chorus either do or don't join him. I don't think, probably in the version we've got, I don't think the chorus can be included in that sinking down, but they say they want to stick with him anyway. And the sort of audience likewise, you might feel you'd like to join him, but we can't. We're sitting in our seats and we got to go home and cook dinner, whatever, afterwards. But Prometheus, sort of what's going to happen next? How do we follow up on that? And what's Zeus going to be doing for evermore, including, as it were, now? If this is our God and this is how he started out, what's he going to grow into? Or has he changed? Has he improved? How did that all happen? And where do humans sort of fit in the great plan? Whose plan is it? What was Prometheus's plan? Why does he care about us so much? So there are all these questions. I think having just the one play and then having to figure for ourselves, what do we do next with this material? And then you look at the different versions that from the 19th century on particularly, well, actually all the way through. I mean, there's a tremendous long tradition of different versions of the Prometheus story as to what happened. And some of them very famous. The two Shelleys, Mr. and Mrs. Shelley, Percy Bysshe Shelley with the Prometheus Unbound, where Zeus is deposed, and Mary Shelley and the Frankenstein creation use of intelligence, technology, and so on. So people have done pretty extraordinary things with the story. In some ways, all the more easily because we don't have the next play that we know existed, but we don't quite know how it went. So I'm not entirely disappointed that we don't have the other play. We can fantasize and remake it over and over, and we won't all make it the same way.
I think that's completely right. That one of the most tantalizing things about this play, but also one of its most extraordinary, is as a result of its being a single play, where the different directions we might take it in have profound consequences. I don't think there's any other single surviving play where, if we imagine what the sequel might be, that it would have such consequence for who we are, uh, what we are, what the gods are. I mean, they're just very big questions as well. I wondered if I could just pick up on one of the things you mentioned there about Prometheus being philanthropic, from the Greek philanthropos. Could you maybe unpack for us a little bit what that is in this case? Because we all think of Prometheus bringing fire, and that is the first image that we have of him in this play. But then he delivers this extraordinary speech where it turns out he's basically given humans everything, or every technical thing, including writing, for example, or how to ride a horse, all the sort of basic things that you need, as you said, to survive. Is that surprising too, the way that Prometheus is presented in this respect?
Yes and no, I would say. During the 5th century BCE, the interest in how human society evolved and how different, even political systems sort of evolved, was something that several Greek thinkers start engaging with and writing about and speculating and arguing about. So the question of how did human beings, and to some degree, how unique are humans, how different, is actually something I get into a little bit in the music book you refer to, the question of, the uniqueness or not of human beings, which has come back much more into focus in recent years. So the idea that technological skills, technology and social, political planning and organization and language, and then writing and culture and the arts, the purpose of those and the origin of those were quite widely discussed and very, obviously authors, thinkers, philosophers, and artists are particularly interested in where does writing and thinking and philosophy and art come from. So it may not have been that every Greek from day to day spent the whole time wondering, I wonder how, but so to that extent, the idea that somehow humans have some gifts, skills, attributes that they acquired that other creatures don't have, was and is. I mean, I think it's not that surprising that it's a matter of real curiosity and fascination, even while at the moment there's quite a lot of revision of that going on. It turns out some animals can do quite a lot of things that we didn't credit them with before. But even there, the book of Genesis is quite interested in where human beings stand in relation to other animals and God's plan, etc. So the question of the nature of divinities and where gods or the god or whatever comes from and how he, she, they, whatever came to be there, where in many societies it isn't the case. There's always just been one there from the very beginning. in many religious systems, there's more than one divinity. Sometimes there's been a genealogy of divinities taking over from other divinities or sharing things. And then the question of where did humans come from? Why are human beings, and particularly either who made us or how did we evolve, and why, if we have these special gifts, that we are able to plan things and talk to each other and write stuff and build houses and cook, why did somebody have a plan that that should be the case, that we'd be exceptional? Did that just happen? If so, is it something that humans have, a sort of divine, a special spark of intelligence? And the Greek word for intelligence would be something like metis. And Prometheus is forethinking. So an allegorical reading would say, well, human beings have Prometheia. They have smarts and they can do certain things. And if you are religious, which most people have been until the last couple of hundred years, at least in the societies we know, then you may wonder, would the gods feel threatened by someone who is really smart and getting smarter all the time and figuring stuff up and trying to build towers up to heaven and master all the languages, whatever it may be? So all these stories about the limitations of humans or God's attitude to humans, but then the question of maybe God planned humans as something that he was really fond of and proud of. That's what we used to, on the whole, most of us, of the Abrahamic traditions. God creates humans as a special deal, something really like himself. In other traditions, humans come from somewhere else. Maybe there's several different versions of humans, like sort of Neanderthals and this human, whatever. The Greek tradition often says, but not always, that Prometheus created humans out of mud. He's a potter god. So making pots, you put the mud together and you shape it, and then you use fire to turn it into this beautiful, useful object that you live with and make use of. So is Prometheus the creator of humans, and he's fond of humans because we're his kind of deal? In which case Zeus and other Olympian gods are not as invested really in human beings as Prometheus. So, because we're never told in Prometheus Bound why Prometheus cares so much about humans and saves them from Zeus's plan. We never told either why exactly did Zeus want to annihilate.
Right.
Great word, aistosai, make them invisible, to obliterate the human race. And there are quite a lot of stories in Greek mythology, I'm sure many of you have read them, about wiping humans out. The flood is one version of it. The Trojan War to reduce the human population. Zeus was annoyed at him. So there are quite a number of different stories in which human races get wiped out and then new ones are created or whatever. Prometheus, in this case, has intervened in part of the civil war. There's been a sort of military coup in which Zeus has, with Prometheus's help, because Prometheus is smart enough to figure out some plan, we're told, that he is able to overthrow the older generation of gods, which Prometheus himself actually belongs to, which is also kind of startling, puzzling as to how is this all going on? And then, so he's helped Zeus with his coup. Zeus has taken over, handed out various goodies and benefit. You can be minister of this, you can be minister of that. And then his particular pet enemies, okay, well, we'll chain this one to a rock and drive a stake through the middle of it. That'll teach him. And Prometheus, meanwhile, though, has intervened to save the humans that he really cares about. And Zeus is absolutely livid. So it's not great. I mean, sitting in the theater looking at this guy saying, well, yes, I did this. I saved him. I gave them all this stuff, and look what they can do now. And we're sitting in the theater thinking, well, yeah, that's good, thank you. And feeling,
And then he's punished for it very dramatically.
yeah. And then what is Zeus about? This is the king of the gods. So different people have, again, in trying to make sense of this Zeus. Was he just impatient? We're told he's young, so he hasn't kind of settled down yet. He's just an adolescent, sort of a bit out of control. And there's also, there's a really uncomfortable deal, isn't there, around Zeus's pursuit of women and his stalking and torment of Io.
Yeah.
And how that's going to turn out, and that he's not apparently going to give up that habit. And to be frank, if you look at Greek culture and antiquity, and most of the cultures we can study in, not just in antiquity, but arguably up to the present day, the extremely rich and famous and royal and powerful guys tend not to behave very decently towards women. It's obvious. And the Greeks recognized that. So their gods are part of that ruling class that dominates, pursues its own desires at the cost. And so Io is put on stage as one of those victims. Thetis is another in the future that he's still pursuing. And that's very disconcerting for modern audience, the way a lot of other things in this play are disconcerting.
Yeah.
We're not sure what an ancient playwright and his audience made of that. There are some cultures where accepting that as normal male behavior seems to be pretty widespread. So it may be that people thought of the Greek male gods as just being guys. And the female gods actually aren't that different. Aphrodite and others. So the sexual mores are different, but it seems from this play, doesn't it, that we are meant to feel horrified and disgusted at Io's situation. And that is not just because Hera has intervened, it's because Zeus's selfish imposition of his own desires are revolting. And again, this playwright has given us that. And Prometheus is helping Io as best he can sort of deal with it and trying to reassure her, well, at least you're going to get something good out of it in the end.
Yeah.
So again, it's why does he care so much? Why does Prometheus care? Why is he so philanthropic? And there have been one or some critics who've tried to claim, a bit in the sort of Mary Shelley trajectory, you could say, that we're meant to get to understand that technology and engineering skills, building houses and shipping and mining, etc., aren't actually the key to living as good human beings. That it's a sort of danger or overstepping of human natural limitations. So we're meant to recognize that Prometheus has sort of upset the natural order of things. So perhaps, this isn't Mary Shelley, but there have been 1-2 readings of the play that have suggested we're meant to see that Zeus actually has a good plan, that human beings should be decent and smart and kind and invent democracy. And that's what's going to happen in the long run. The Prometheus doesn't quite get that yet. That's why he has to be taught a lesson. I don't myself think that the dynamics of this play really convey that. It seems Zeus is arbitrary and fierce and cruel and vindictive behaviors, and the models of his power, the agents, Kratos and Bia, are so crude and fierce and unfeeling, or not even unfeeling. Kratos seems to enjoy inflicting,
Absolutely.
say even sadistic. That those elements of Zeus's character and behavior and administration of power, as well as his treatment of Io and her family, where he's going to wipe out all of her family if she doesn't succumb to his desires.
Yeah.
That those make it really hard for us to see Zeus as having a benevolent plan for how the planet can best flourish. And so Prometheus as his victim, and the sympathy that he tries to show for him and that others show for him, the chorus shows for him, it seems hard not to feel that we as an audience share that. And
Yeah.
we are grateful to him for whatever he's done, why ever he did it. Now, it may have been the first play that makes quite clear that why he's pro-human. Maybe he did create humans. But it's odd, he doesn't mention pottery amongst the gifts that he gave humans. And so, yeah, it's one of the things we can fill in through the lucky, unlucky chance that this one play stands just by itself, and we have to kind of put in the prequel and the sequel to make it make sense for ourselves.
That's fantastic. Thank you. And gives us a very good sense of the complexities of Prometheus and how to understand him, and also of Zeus, and how also to, if we wish, create a political reading of this play as a result. I also really appreciated that you drew our attention to Io or Io, who, if you watch the play or you read the play, you realize how much space, how much time she takes up. I mean, the scene with her is a very long and significant one. But of course, Prometheus in our imagination is Prometheus without Io when we go beyond this play.
Let me just add one thing there. Although we don't have the music and the choreography sort of written into the manuscript, we just have the words. We can gauge fairly distinctively from the written text and from the metrical nature of the different utterances that the characters are making, we can tell that not only the chorus, who regularly in Greek drama, they sing and dance, quite how they dance when they're up there in a flying machine. We're not sure how that may have worked in this play, but the chorus normally sing, and that gives them a whole different lyrical kind of expressive capacity that the spoken lines of the other characters don't have. In this play, and it's actually something that Aeschylus doesn't normally do, and it's one of the reasons some people doubt that Aeschylus is the author or the sole author of this particular play and trilogy. But in this play, Io, when she enters, and at different points in the scene, is singing, and she's using lyric meters with a lot of exclamations and cries, and she's clearly also dancing. There's a lot of reference to the fact that she's sort of leaping spasmodically. She's being attacked by this sort of wasp-like gadfly thing. And so there's a very energy, Prometheus is nailed to this rock. He can't move. The chorus have been flying in, and then they come down to the ground and they're somewhat settled. So they presumably dance when they sing. But then Io comes in, leaping and twisting and turning and shrieking and singing full blast. And it's, if one sees the play performed, it is, depending what musical idiom you show. There's one they did at UC Berkeley. Eric A. Gamel brought in a production from Santa Cruz where they had rock music. And she came in to a kind of funk hip-hop beat that was completely different from the more sort of white rock sound that the chorus had been seeing before. So she brought in this whole different, she's a human. The rest of them have all been divinities in their various different vocal idioms, modes, whatever. Prometheus sings a little bit, which is very, very unusual for a male hero on the Greek stage. I mean, the play's just full of unusual things. It's just a most extraordinary play, amazing play. And Io, even though in some ways she's completely out of left field, I mean, what on earth is she doing in this story? Well, 13 generations later, there's going to be this guy Heracles born, and he's going to come and visit. I mean, that's pretty far-fetched. She really has almost nothing to do with the story. And yet, as a sort of counterweight or a human representative who comes to the edges of the earth and encounters this divinity who's suffering for humankind and sings her heart out, sings, and it's completely unexpected.
Yeah.
And in some ways completely sort of random. And yet it's very, very startling and engaging because the terror she's feeling and the pain, sort of psychological, emotional, and physical that's being inflicted on her as a target of this guy's desires gives a whole other sort of dimension. What does Zeus the tyrant, what's the impact of his regime? This is what's going on.
And a very human impact, a very bodily one.
So the music, as I say, is something that we tend, unless we're reminded of it, sort of, by pedantic scholars who tell you, oh, they're using this meter here rather than there, or a stage production if they actually incorporate music in the places where the text shows that music was being used, that they were singing. We can sometimes miss that. And Greek tragedy can be incredibly dull if you just speak the whole thing in a sort of the choruses particularly, and some of the solo songs I mean, if you can just imagine going to the opera and they decide, well, we actually aren't going to sing this aria, we'll just speak it. So
I couldn't agree more. I couldn't agree more, as you know.
yes,
and
written beautifully.
and we
About music, yeah.
And we should wrap up our conversation, but that was a very nice segue to just how I wanted to end, which is to really think about this as theatre in terms of music and dance, movement, the contrast, as you said, between the stationary body and these moving bodies around him, especially Io. And what an extraordinary play that invites still today great feats of theatre technology. I mean, how are you going to stage the arrival of these daughters of ocean? Are they going to be in winged chariots or not? As many scholars have wondered for a long time for the original production, how are you going to stage the entrance of Ocean himself? And then, I don't know if you have any thoughts about the final cataclysmic scene. I think you described it as a tsunami-like scene. I like that. What can we reconstruct, or should we even attempt to reconstruct the original staging of that scene?
Well, yeah, it's going to depend on what theatre space one is using and what resources one has. I suppose in practical terms, I mean, whether or not with modern sound effects and possible video use and so on to suggest one can do various things there. And some opera houses have pretty fantastic resources, but myself, I'm inclined to think that if you make some noise and mist and smoke and stuff, that if one can find a way to have Prometheus himself sink into the ground, that's the main thing I'd like to be, in terms of actual, rather than just leaving it to the words and the imagination or pulling a curtain down, I think if you do have a stage setting where he can be engulfed in the earth, that is appropriate. I mean, Earth is his mother. And if there can be some suggestion that Zeus's punishment, next stage of punishment, the eagle is still another, somewhat even more ghastly prospect. But we're not going to show that. I mean, we probably, as the play goes on, the one or two moments where you can remind audiences of, because for many people and for Greek visual art, if you look at, articles about Prometheus in myth, in picture books or books that have, there are lots of very vivid, sometimes very beautiful, though horrific, vase paintings of Prometheus chained up with an eagle ripping out his liver. That story was known before this play. Hesiod had narrated it. And so anyway, if we've seen the eagle, hinted or heard about the eagle, we've seen him visited by all these flying creatures. And then Io running along the ground and being told about all the places that she will be wandering up and down all over the earth. And now he's going to be buried alive for a few hundred or thousand, it's sort of vague, years before he comes out and then gets his liver eaten a few more centuries. But having him actually swallowed up in the earth, but then perhaps with some sort of reminder that the earth is his mom. And if we know our Hesiod stories, actually, we'll know that the succession stories of gods overthrowing the previous generation, Mother Earth tends to play a pretty crucial role, either as the one who's actually helping overthrow the father, with the castration of Uranus, or as the one who's helping advise other divinities how to rebel against their father. So the idea that Prometheus, there's some sort of comfort or strength or reinforcement, possibly. I mean, there's nothing really there in the text to justify me in throwing this into the mix. But again, I'm thinking partly of Shelley, where Shelley's lyric drama, it's not very dramatic. It's not really very stageable. But the female divinities that visit Prometheus and that help this character Demogorgon to overthrow Jupiter, Zeus, and that are part of the comfortably, I guess the wrong word, peacefully anarchic, not politically dominated, not militaristic regime that emerges at the end, where equality and love and peace are reigning. It's female divinities that Shelley keeps bringing in as companions for Prometheus. And so we do have this note that I mentioned at the beginning of in the manuscript that seems to tell us that Gaia, Gay, and Heracles are characters in the Prometheus trilogy, maybe, because they're not there in Prometheus Bound, but they're listed in the characters along with Ocean and Hermes and so on for this play. So if Gaia is going to have a role in the next play, or Gaia Themis, she's sort of both characters. And Themis is the goddess of order and propriety and righteousness. And Prometheus is her son. So maybe there's something. This is a very long-winded way of saying I would like him to descend into the earth with all this stuff going on, but possibly have something about this gaping earth that reminds us that this is his mother, and
Oh,
possibly some sort of place where he can hang in there for another 10,000 or 30,000, and come back and actually eventually be restored as our friend, helping us make pots with his kiln and his fire. Somehow the gods sort this all out, and human beings are allowed to keep on going. But that's just. I'm not a stage director, and I don't know exactly, and I'm not a designer, so I don't quite know how one would make this receptive, supportive earth thing as a prop.
That's great, and brings us back in a nice way to the beginning, in terms of thinking about the other characters in play across these tragedies, and what might happen, how they might be evoked in various ways. I should draw this to a close, but Mark, thank you so much for taking part in this conversation. It was really fantastic to hear your thoughts on this remarkable play.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and it's really been fun. And it's always, it's a play to think about. You talked about coming to Berkeley to do your work, and you did wonderful work, and things have gone right from the first. My own dissertation was on this play, and I haven't spent the whole of the last 50 years talking about this play, but it's wonderful to get back and think about it again after all this time. Thank you.
Thank you.